Dust rolled through Bear Creek. It looked like smoke from a fire you couldn't see. A stagecoach, all rattled wood and tired leather, jerked to a stop. The door swung open, and a woman stepped out. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 26, but her eyes held a story much older than that. A story with scars she never, ever spoke of. She was clutching a worn bag, like it was the only thing holding her together. She'd come west chasing something called freedom, or maybe she was just running. Across town, a man swung down from his horse. His name was Jonah Callahan. He was a rancher, a widower, and his face looked like it had been carved from granite and grief. He was 34, carrying the weight of a ranch that was failing, a reputation he had to protect, and an 11-year-old daughter who was growing wilder by the day. Two strangers. A woman running from her past, and a man haunted by his. They were about to collide in a place where survival wasn't a promise. It was a fight, and that fight was just getting started. The boarding house smelled of old kerosene and new bread, the kind of smell that tries to trick you into feeling at home when you're 1,000 miles from it. Clara set her bag down at the foot of a narrow bed and took her first real breath in what felt like a year. The room was a box. One chair, one washstand, one cracked window looking out over a muddy street. But it was hers. She could lock the door. She could finally stop looking over her shoulder. She unpinned her hat, her fingers trembling just a little, and smoothed her hair. She'd come here to teach, to build a life where no one could tell her what to do or who to be. A life that wasn't already over. Then, a sharp knock rattled the door. "Miss Bennett," the landlady's voice cut through the wood. "You've got company." Clara's blood went cold. Company? No one on this earth knew she was here. It couldn't be. Not him. Not yet. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked down the creaking stairs, and the sight waiting for her in the narrow hall made her stop dead. It was a man, all right. But not the one from her nightmares. This man's shoulders nearly touched both sides of the hallway. He had dust on his boots and a shadow on his face that wasn't just from the dim light. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim, and hiding behind his long coat was a little girl with dark braids and the oldest eyes Clara had ever seen. The man cleared his throat, a rough, gravelly sound. "You the new school teacher?" Clara straightened her spine, pulling her composure around her like a shawl. "I am. Clara Bennett." He gave a short, curt nod. "Jonah Callahan. This here's my daughter, Ellie. She's 11, bright as a new penny and twice as stubborn. She needs more learning than I can give her." He looked down at the girl. "Figured I'd make your acquaintance." Clara offered a small smile to the girl, who was sizing her up like a hawk watching a field mouse. "Hello, Ellie. It's a pleasure to meet you. Do you like to read?" For a second, just a flicker, a light of interest sparked in Ellie's eyes. "Sometimes, but Pa makes me do chores first." "That sounds fair," Clara said, her voice gentle. "But books can take you to places that chores can't. Maybe we can find the right one for you." The girl tilted her head, a strange, calculating look on her young face. "Do you know about horses?" Jonah looked a little embarrassed. "Ellie." But Clara answered before he could stop her. "I know enough to stay in the saddle when one decides to run." She looked straight at the girl. "Why do you ask?" A ghost of a grin touched Ellie's lips. "Because Pa says only horse sense matters out here. He says readin' don't keep you from getting thrown." The corner of Jonah Callahan's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not really. His face had forgotten how to do that, but it was something that softened the hard lines for a moment. The landlady, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who seemed to collect gossip like other people collect stamps, bustled forward. "Oh, Miss Bennett, Mr. Callahan owns the biggest spread west of town. A very important man." Her eyes darted between them, hungry for a story. Jonah ignored her, his gaze locked on Clara. "I'll be direct, ma'am. I don't have much use for fancy ideas. I need Ellie taught her sums and her letters. I need her kept steady. I don't want her getting ideas above her station." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You can manage that?" Clara felt a spark of defiance. She lifted her chin. "Mr. Callahan, I am here to teach your daughter how to think for herself. I will give her the tools to build her own confidence. And if that puts her above her station, as you say, then yes." She held his gaze. "I can definitely manage that." The air in the hallway went tight. Jonah's brows pulled low, a thundercloud gathering on his face. Clara expected him to yell, to turn on his heel and drag his daughter out of there. But he didn't. Instead, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name passed through his eyes. It looked almost like respect. Grudging, angry respect. And that's when Ellie, who had been watching them like a tennis match, let out a small, secret smile. It was the smile of a girl who knew, right down to her bones, that something had just begun. And it was going to be interesting. The next morning, the air was so clear and cold, you could see the teeth of the mountains against the pale blue sky. Clara walked to the schoolhouse, a small, sad-looking building with peeling paint and a bell rope that hung like a forgotten noose. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was hers. By 8 o'clock, a dozen children sat on the rough wooden benches. They were a mess of muddy boots, mismatched clothes, and restless energy. One boy was trying to drown a grasshopper in an inkwell. Clara rapped her knuckles on the desk. Hard. The sound cracked like a whip. Sit straight, hands folded, eyes front. And to her surprise, they did. Every single one of them. She didn't have a booming voice or the size of a ranch hand, but she had something else. An authority that came from a place of deep, unbreakable will. They sensed it. Ellie Callahan sat near the back, arms crossed, chin up, radiating defiance. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice calm and even. "My name is Miss Bennett. If you are here to learn, we will get on just fine. If you are here to waste my time—" She let her eyes drift over to the boy with the inkwell. "You'll be chopping firewood for the stove before you can blink." A few of the kids snickered. Ellie's mouth twitched, but she fought the smile. By noon, they'd covered arithmetic, spelling, and a passage from a book about a long, hard journey. Clara moved fast, keeping them so busy they didn't have time to get bored or make trouble. When she dismissed them, they spilled out into the yard, cheeks flushed, fingers stained with ink, but buzzing with a new kind of energy. Jonah was there, leaning against the porch rail, arms folded across his broad chest. He'd been waiting. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're all still in one piece. I suppose that's something." Clara dusted chalk from her dress. "It's more than something. They listened, and they learned." His eyes stayed on her a moment too long. "Ellie said you read to them. You really believe that nonsense matters out here?" "I do," she answered, meeting his stare without flinching. "Books open doors that even the biggest cattle ranch can't. If you want Ellie to grow up to be more than just another ranch hand, she'll need to know her way around a sentence as well as a saddle." His mouth pressed into a hard, thin line. "I want her grounded. I want her safe. I don't want her head filled with dreams that can't put food on the table." "And what if they can?" Clara challenged, her voice soft but sharp as a needle. "What if her dreams are the very things that will save her one day?" The silence stretched between them, thick with things they weren't saying. His jaw was tight, his whole body rigid, like he was fighting a war inside himself. But he didn't argue. He just tipped his hat, a gesture that seemed to cost him a great deal of effort. "Supper's waiting," he muttered, not looking at her. "Come by the ranch tomorrow evening. Ellie will be expecting you." It wasn't an invitation. It sounded more like an order. And as he turned and walked away, Clara felt a strange, unsettling flutter in her chest. She was winning him over, she could feel it. But she had the dangerous feeling that winning over Jonah Callahan was like trying to tame a wildfire. The Callahan Ranch was a sprawling, wind-bitten place where the fences looked tired and the land looked stubborn. When Clara arrived the next evening, she found Jonah in the corral with a young mare that was fighting him every step of the way. The horse's eyes were wild, its hooves kicking up clouds of dust as it fought the rope. Clara stopped at the gate, her whole body going rigid. The sound of the panicked horse, the smell of dust and fear, it all came rushing back. Another horse, another time, the sickening jolt and the fall that left her bruised in places no one could see. Jonah's voice cut through her memory, calm and steady. "Easy, girl. Easy now." He wasn't yanking the rope. He was just holding it, a firm, unmoving anchor in the horse's storm. He moved with a quiet authority that was mesmerizing to watch. The mare snorted, pulled, and then, slowly, it stilled, its sides heaving. Jonah reached out and stroked its muzzle. "See?" he murmured, his voice impossibly gentle. "Not so wild after all." Ellie, perched on the top rail of the fence, clapped her hands. "You always win, Pa!" Then Jonah saw Clara standing at the gate, her face pale. "You ride?" he asked, his voice back to its usual gruffness as he wiped sweat from his brow. "Enough," she said, her own voice tight. A mischievous grin spread across Ellie's face. "Prove it, Pa. Let her try Daisy." Jonah hesitated. Clara could see the conflict in his eyes. Daisy was half broke, spirited. But then Clara lifted her chin, and in that one small movement, she dared him. And Jonah Callahan was not a man to back down from a dare. Minutes later, she was in the saddle. The horse, Daisy, shifted beneath her, a bundle of nervous energy, testing her. Clara's hands trembled on the reins, a cold fear snaking up her spine, but she kept her back straight and her jaw set. She would not let this man or this horse see her fear. Daisy tried a small buck, a quick, jarring hop. Clara leaned with it, murmuring the same calm words Jonah had used, and slowly, miraculously, the mare settled. Ellie's eyes were wide with amazement. "She's good, Pa. Did you see that?" Jonah just nodded, his gaze fixed on Clara. He was looking at the flush in her cheeks, the fire in her eyes. He could see the fear she was trying so hard to hide. But she hadn't backed down. She hadn't given in. Something inside his chest pulled tight. It was more than respect. It was something else. Something dangerous. After supper, as Ellie clattered dishes in the kitchen, Jonah leaned against the doorframe, watching Clara. "Not bad," he grunted. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Is that high praise coming from a man who thought I was full of fancy ideas?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You've got grit, Miss Bennett. I'll give you that. But grit can get a person hurt out here." Her voice softened, but her eyes never lost their edge. "So can giving up." And in that moment, for the first time since his wife died, Jonah felt the solid ground beneath his feet begin to shift. This woman, this quiet, stubborn, fearless schoolteacher was undoing him piece by piece. Just then, Ellie burst back into the room, her face glowing. "Miss Bennett, will you come back tomorrow? Please?" Jonah opened his mouth, maybe to say no, to put some distance back between them. But Clara answered first, her smile warm and genuine as she looked at the girl. "Of course, I will." Ellie threw her arms around Clara's waist in a fierce, sudden hug. Then she was gone, running off to bed. Jonah and Clara were left alone in the quiet kitchen. The lamplight cast long shadows, making the small room feel intimate. He cleared his throat. She hasn't laughed like that in years," he admitted, the words sounding like they were torn from him. Clara's gaze held his. "Then perhaps you should let her." He wanted to argue. He wanted to build his walls back up. But he couldn't. He just nodded, his voice rough. "Maybe I should." But as Clara left that night, a new thought took root in Jonah's mind. It wasn't just Ellie she was bringing back to life. It was him. And that scared him more than any half-broke horse ever could, because he knew deep down that the last time he'd let himself feel this way, it had ended in a fresh-dug grave on a windswept hill. Autumn came fast, painting the plains in shades of gold and rust. The wind had a new bite to it, a promise of the winter to come. Clara had been in Bear Creek for 6 weeks. She was no longer the new schoolteacher. She was Miss Bennett, a woman who ran a tight ship in the classroom, but had a surprising softness for any child who was genuinely trying. Ellie Callahan, in particular, was blossoming. The sullen, defiant girl was slowly being replaced by a curious, bright one. She started staying after school, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She'd help Clara clean the slate boards, her small voice filling the quiet room as she read aloud from whatever book Clara put in her hands. Jonah saw the change. He saw the light coming back into his daughter's eyes, but he kept his distance, watching Clara from afar, a silent, brooding guardian. One evening, Clara was walking out to the ranch for their now regular supper when the sky turned a bruised purple. Thunderheads piled up on the horizon, dark and menacing. By the time she reached the porch, the first fat drops of rain were falling. Moments later, the sky tore open. "Storm's here to stay," Jonah said, pulling her inside as lightning bleached the world white and thunder shook the very foundations of the house. "You're not going back in this." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, began to tremble. She hated storms, hated the feeling of being trapped, the violent noise, the lack of control. Jonah noticed the way her knuckles were white, the rigid set of her shoulders. "Storms bother you?" She gave a stiff nod, unable to speak. "Since I was a child." There was something in her eyes then, something raw and unguarded that called to a broken piece of him. Before he even knew he was going to do it, he reached across the small kitchen table and covered her trembling hand with his. His hand was calloused and warm, a steady weight in the middle of the chaos. "It's only noise," he said, his voice quiet. Her eyes met his and some of the fear receded. "Sometimes," she whispered, "noise can feel like the end of the world." They stayed that way for a long moment, the storm raging outside, a fragile peace growing between them inside. The silence was broken by Ellie, who came in carrying 3 mugs of warm milk, oblivious to the current passing between the 2 adults. She chattered about a new calf, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the rolling thunder. Jonah found himself watching not his daughter, but Clara. He watched the way she smiled at Ellie, the genuine warmth in her eyes, and he realized with a jolt that his house hadn't felt this warm, this alive, since before Sarah, since before everything went wrong. That night, something shifted for good. The storm had broken down a wall between them. In the days that followed, Clara became a fixture at the ranch. She mended a tear in Ellie's dress, with stitches so neat and small it shamed his own clumsy attempts. She showed Ellie how to press wildflowers in a heavy book, and soon the windowsills were lined with tiny, colorful blossoms. Jonah started noticing things. The way a loose strand of her hair would catch the light. The unwavering steadiness in her voice when she explained a difficult math problem to Ellie. The fierce, stubborn spark in her eyes whenever she disagreed with him, which was often. He was losing his grip on his grief. This woman was prying his fingers open, one by one, and letting the light in. One afternoon, he found her behind the schoolhouse, splitting kindling for the stove. Her sleeves were rolled up, her face was flushed with effort, and a thin sheen of sweat covered her brow. She swung the axe with a clean, efficient motion that surprised him. He just stood there and watched for a minute, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. "You swing that axe like you mean it," he finally said. She paused, leaning on the handle to catch her breath. A faint smile touched her lips. "Work has never frightened me, Mr. Callahan." Her smile faded, and her eyes grew serious. What frightens me is being dependent on anyone. Depending on someone means they can take everything away. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He thought of his wife, of the fever that had come out of nowhere, of his own helplessness as he watched her slip away. "I know something about that," he said, his voice thick. Her gaze was solemn, searching. "You lost someone." It wasn't a question. He nodded, the old ache constricting his chest. "My wife, Sarah, 5 years ago." Clara lowered the axe. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but her tone was not. It held no pity, only a deep, quiet understanding that spoke of her own hidden sorrows. He looked at her then, really looked at her, standing there with the axe in her hand, strong and capable and carrying her own ghosts, and a feeling he thought was long dead and buried began to stir inside him. It felt a lot like hope. That night, after supper, it was Ellie who sealed their fate. She dragged them both to the old porch swing. "You both sit," she commanded, with all the authority of an 11-year-old on a mission. She ran inside and came back with a heavy quilt, which she proceeded to tuck around them. Then, satisfied with her work, she climbed onto Clara's lap. She leaned back, sighing contentedly. "See, Pa?" she said, her voice sleepy. "Now it feels like a family." Jonah went completely still. The words struck him right in the heart, a painful, beautiful blow. He looked at Clara, who was smoothing Ellie's hair, her expression soft and unreadable in the moonlight. He wanted to deny it, to push it away, but he couldn't. It did feel like a family. And God help him, he wanted it to be true more than he'd wanted anything in a long, long time. Just as this fragile new beginning was taking root, a shadow fell over Bear Creek. Not a literal shadow, but something worse. A stranger rode into town, a man in a city suit and a derby hat who looked completely out of place. He checked into the boarding house, and the first person he started asking questions to was the town gossip, Mrs. Gable. And the questions he was asking were all about a woman who had arrived on the stagecoach 6 weeks ago. A woman with dark hair and quiet, haunted eyes. A woman named Clara Bennett. The first snow came early that year, a fine white powder that dusted the dead grass and clung to the branches of the cottonwoods. It made the world quiet, but it was a deceptive quiet. Clara was walking to the schoolhouse one morning when Jonah rode up, his horse kicking up puffs of snow. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Rustlers," he said, the word like a stone spat from his mouth. "Took 6 head of cattle last night, cut the fence clean through. They left a sign, a brand I've never seen before. They wanted me to know." Clara's heart gave a hard thump. She had seen that look on men's faces before. It was the look of a man pushed to a breaking point. "Will you go after them?" "I have to," he said, his jaw tight as a clenched fist. "Cattle are this ranch's blood, but it's more than that. This is a test. They're testing me. If I let this go, they'll be back for more." He looked past her, toward the schoolhouse where the faint sound of children's laughter could be heard. His voice dropped, becoming low and serious. "It's dangerous. I need you to stay at the ranch with Ellie while I'm gone. Keep her close." "Of course," she said, a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. 2 nights later, Jonah rode out with 3 other ranchers, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. Clara and Ellie sat by the fire in the Callahan ranch house, the silence inside as loud as the howling wind outside. Ellie sat by the window, her small face pressed against the cold glass. "Pa always comes back," she whispered, but her voice was thin and shaky. Clara pulled the girl into a hug, wrapping the quilt around them both. "Your father is the most stubborn man I have ever met," she said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "That counts for a lot." But inside, her own fears were a frantic, rattling thing. She knew what it was to lose everything in the blink of an eye. She prayed Ellie wouldn't have to learn that lesson. Just before dawn, the sound they'd been dreading ripped through the night. Gunfire. A series of sharp, ugly cracks that echoed across the frozen valley. Clara was on her feet in an instant, her heart pounding in her throat. Ellie cried out, clinging to her. Moments later, they heard the barn door slam open. Clara grabbed a lantern and ran outside, her boots sinking into the fresh snow. Jonah was staggering toward the house, one arm clutched to his side, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve. "Pa!" Ellie screamed, running to him and throwing her arms around his waist. "I'm fine," he grunted, but his face was pale as a ghost. "Bullet just grazed me, that's all." Clara grabbed his other arm, her touch firm and sure, and helped him inside. He leaned on her, his weight heavy, and the fact that he didn't protest scared her more than the blood. She got him to the kitchen table and immediately ripped a strip of clean linen from a dish towel, pressing it hard against the wound on his shoulder. He hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. "You've done this before," he muttered, looking at her with a new, surprised expression. Her hands never faltered. "A woman learns to tend to all sorts of wounds in this world, Mr. Callahan. Some are deeper than others." Their eyes met over the flickering lamplight, and in that moment, the weight of all their unspoken secrets hung between them. But before either of them could say another word, the sound of hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Not one horse. Several. Jonah tensed, trying to push himself up. "They followed me." Clara didn't hesitate. She turned, reached above the fireplace, and took down the heavy rifle that rested there. With a series of clicks that were shockingly loud in the quiet room, she checked that it was loaded. Jonah stared at her, his mouth slightly open. "You know how to use that?" She chambered around, her jaw set like stone. "I'm not helpless." The front door rattled as someone kicked it. A rough voice shouted from outside. "Callahan! We know you're in there! We finished your friends! Now you can hand over the deed to this ranch, or we'll burn it to the ground with you and the girl inside." Jonah struggled to rise, a low growl in his throat, but Clara put a hand on his good shoulder, pushing him firmly back into the chair. "You'll bleed out. Let me handle this." "Don't go!" Ellie cried, her eyes wide with terror. Clara knelt down, cupping the girl's face in her hands. "I will protect you and your father," she said, her voice fierce and low. "That is a promise." Then she stood, took a deep breath, and walked onto the porch, leveling the rifle. 3 men on horseback circled in the snowy yard, their faces ugly in the flickering light of the torches they carried. "Callahan's a little busy right now," Clara called out, her voice ringing out sharp and clear in the cold air. "So you'll have to deal with me." One of the men laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "Well, look what we got here. A little canary." But the laughter died in his throat when Clara cocked the rifle. The sound was final, deadly. "You want to test me?" she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "The first one of you that makes a move toward this house will be dead before he hits the ground. I promise you that." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the crackle of the torches and the nervous shifting of the horses. The men looked at each other, then back at the woman on the porch. They saw no fear in her eyes, only cold, hard resolve. The leader finally spat into the snow. "Ain't worth dying over, but this ain't over, Callahan!" They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Clara slowly lowered the rifle, her whole body starting to shake now that the danger had passed. She turned and saw Jonah standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of pain, shock, and something else she couldn't decipher. Ellie was pressed against his side, staring at Clara as if she'd just seen a miracle. "You." Jonah's voice was a rough whisper. "You faced down 3 armed men." Her knees felt weak, but she held his gaze. "I wasn't going to let them take this from you. I wasn't going to let them hurt Ellie." Something inside him, The hard, frozen thing he'd been carrying for 5 years, finally broke. He took a shaky step forward, reached out, and took her hand. His voice was raw, desperate. "I'll tie you down like a wild mare if I have to, Clara Bennett. Don't you dare run from me now." The words should have angered her. They should have felt like a cage. But looking into his eyes, she didn't see a man trying to control her. She saw a man terrified of losing the first light he'd seen in years. And for the first time in her life, Clara Bennett didn't want to run. She wanted to stay. But the danger wasn't gone. It had just retreated into the shadows. And another danger, one she had been running from for months, was getting closer every single day. The man in the derby hat had learned her name, and he had sent a telegram back east. The rustlers did not come back that night. The air slowly lost the sharp tang of gunpowder and was filled only with the cold, clean smell of snow. Inside the small ranch house, the world had shrunk to the space between two people. Clara finished bandaging Jonah's shoulder, her movements precise and gentle. Her heart was still beating a wild rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Ellie had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled up asleep in a big armchair by the fire, her face peaceful for the first time in hours. The quiet in the kitchen was thick, heavy with unspoken words. "You didn't even hesitate," Jonah said finally, his voice low. He studied her face in the lamplight, his eyes searching for an answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. "You stood on that porch like you'd been born with a rifle in your hands." Clara tied off the bandage, then met his gaze directly. The time for secrets was over. "I've faced down worse things than armed men, Jonah." The raw pain in her voice stopped him cold. He reached across the table, his fingers gently brushing against hers. "Tell me." A shuddered look came over her face, the look of someone revisiting a place of great pain. Her throat worked for a moment before she could speak. "There was a man back in St. Louis, a wealthy man, a cruel man. He decided he wanted me, and my father." My father agreed. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "They thought my life was something they could buy and sell. I ran the night before the wedding, and I swore on my life that I would never, ever let another man control my destiny again." The story settled in the air between them, ugly and stark. Jonah felt a surge of protective fury so strong it made his wounded shoulder ache. He saw it all now. The steel in her spine, the fear she kept so carefully hidden, the fierce independence that he had mistaken for pride. Slowly, carefully, he closed his hand over hers. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I don't want to control you. I don't want to own you." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I want to stand with you. You saved my ranch tonight. You saved my daughter. You saved me." His voice cracked on the last word, and he had to take a breath before he could continue. He forced the next words out, raw and unpolished and absolutely true. "I love you." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was everything she had run from, and everything she secretly yearned for. She searched his face, looking for a lie, for a trick, for a moment of hesitation. But all she saw was a terrifying, beautiful honesty, and her own walls, the ones she had built so high and so thick, came crumbling down. "Do you have any idea how hard I fought against this?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I told myself I would never need anyone again. I would never trust anyone again. But somewhere between your stubborn pride and Ellie's quiet smiles, you've completely undone me." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I love you too, Jonah Callahan. Heaven help me, I do." Pain forgotten, he pushed himself to his feet and pulled her up from her chair, drawing her against his chest. His good hand came up to cup her face, his thumb gently brushing away the tear, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Then marry me," he breathed, the words a desperate prayer. "Marry me, Clara. Not because you need a protector, not because Ellie needs a mother, but because I don't think I can face another sunrise if you're not in my life." Her breath hitched, a sob of joy and relief caught in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, the word as fierce and binding as any vow. "Yes." He kissed her then. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was the kiss of a man who had been lost in the wilderness for 5 long years and had finally, impossibly, found his way home. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Ellie stirred in her sleep. A small, faint smile touched her lips, as if in her dreams she already knew. Her family wasn't just healing, it was being reborn. But what they didn't know was that the telegram sent by the man in the derby hat had reached its destination. And a man in St. Louis, a man who did not like to be denied what he considered his property, had just boarded a train heading west. His name was Alistair Kane, and he was coming to collect his bride. Word of a wedding travels fast in a small town, and the news that Jonah Callahan was marrying the schoolteacher spread through Bear Creek like a prairie fire. The following Sunday, the little church was packed. People who hadn't seen the inside of a church in years were there, curious to witness the taming of the town's most solitary man. Clara stood at the back of the church, her hands trembling. Mrs. Murphy, the baker's wife, had loaned her an ivory-colored dress. The lace was a little yellowed with age, but it was beautiful. She had never, not once in her life, imagined herself as a bride, not a real one. The wedding she had run from had been a business transaction, a sale. This was different. This was a choice. The old organ wheezed to life. The congregation stood, and Clara started her walk down the short, dusty aisle. Jonah was waiting for her at the altar. His shoulder was still bandaged beneath his Sunday coat, but he stood tall, and the look on his face. It was a look of such raw, undisguised hope that it stole her breath away. Ellie stood between them, clutching a bouquet of winter wildflowers, her face beaming. She was their witness, their anchor. The preacher's words were a blur, but Clara heard the ones that mattered. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health. When Jonah slid the simple gold band onto her finger, she saw that his hand was shaking too. "I promise you," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear. "No one will ever take your freedom from you again, not as long as I am breathing." Tears shone in her eyes as she looked up at him. "And I promise you will never have to face another storm alone. I now pronounce you husband and wife." The church erupted in cheers. Ellie let out a whoop of joy and threw her arms around both of them, squeezing them into a family hug. And in that moment, with the warmth of the small church around them and the sound of their friends cheering, everything felt possible. That evening, the Callahan Ranch, which had been a place of silence and shadows for so long, was filled with light and music. Neighbors brought pots of stew and freshly baked bread. A fiddle scraped out a lively tune, and children chased each other through the snow. Jonah stood on the porch, his arm around his new wife, watching the celebration. He watched Clara laughing with Mrs. Murphy, her face radiant in the lantern light. For the first time in 5 years, the ranch didn't feel like a weight on his shoulders. It felt like a home. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. He looked down at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I was just thinking that I always saw myself as a man tied to his duty, to his land. Turns out, what I really needed was to be tied to you." She smiled back at him. "Lucky for you, cowboy. I don't mind being tied down, as long as the rope is made of love." Ellie came bounding up the steps then, squeezing between them. She stretched her arms out wide to hug them both. "See?" she said triumphantly. "I told you it would feel like a family." Jonah bent down and kissed the top of her head. "You were right, little one. You were right all along." They stood there together, the 3 of them, a new constellation under the vast, star-dusted sky. They knew life wouldn't be easy. There would be hard winters and dry summers. There were still rustlers in the hills and shadows in their pasts. But as they stood there, hands joined, a silent promise was sealed. They had found their way through the darkness. They had built a home not out of wood and stone, but out of courage and hope and second chances. The fiddler started a new song, a sweet, slow waltz. Jonah took Clara's hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Callahan?" She laughed, a sound as clear and bright as a river in springtime. "You may." He led her down from the porch, and they danced in the snow under the watchful eyes of the moon. They didn't know that miles away, a train was chugging steadily westward. They didn't know that the man named Alistair Kane was not coming alone. He was bringing with him a signed contract, a team of lawyers, and a version of the law that was as cold and unforgiving as a winter grave. Their peaceful new life was about to be put to the ultimate test. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you think Alistair will do when he arrives. And don't forget to subscribe, because the fight for the Callahan Ranch has only just begun.